Grace had always believed in love. Ever since she married Ethan, she had been certain that they were meant to be together, a perfect couple, built on trust, passion, and an unbreakable bond. Their love story had all the makings of a fairy tale, or at least that's what Grace had convinced herself. Ethan was her best friend, her confidant, the person she imagined growing old with. He had always been kind and gentle, making her feel safe in a world that sometimes felt chaotic. Tonight was supposed to be special. She had spent the entire afternoon preparing his favorite meal, making sure every detail was perfect. A beautifully set table, soft candlelight, and a homemade dinner that filled their home with warmth. Everything was just as she had envisioned. But the highlight of the evening wasn't the food or the ambience. No, it was the secret she had been carrying in her heart, a secret she was finally ready to share. She was pregnant. The thought filled her with overwhelming joy. A baby. A new life growing inside her. She had rehearsed in her head 1,000 times how she would tell Ethan. She imagined his face lighting up with happiness, his arms wrapping around her in excitement. This was the next chapter in their love story, the beautiful new beginning they had always talked about. But deep inside, there was a shadow lurking at the edges of her happiness, a presence that had haunted her marriage since the beginning. Vivian. Ethan's mother had never approved of Grace. From the moment they had met, Vivian had treated her with cold indifference, making it clear that she did not believe Grace was good enough for her son. Over the years, her words had become sharper, her disdain more evident. She would throw subtle insults at Grace, belittling her cooking, her appearance, even her ability to be a good wife. And the worst part? Ethan never stopped her. Grace had hoped that things would change after they got married. That maybe, with time, Vivian would learn to accept her. But instead, the older woman's influence over Ethan only seemed to grow stronger. She whispered in his ear, feeding him doubts and poisoning his mind against the woman he had once claimed to love unconditionally. Still, Grace held on to hope. Maybe tonight would be different. Maybe this dinner, this announcement, would bring them all closer together. She had invited Vivian, despite everything, because she wanted to believe in the possibility of reconciliation. A child, after all, was a blessing. Perhaps, for the first time, Vivian would see Grace not as an outsider, but as family. As she placed the last dish on the table and took a deep breath, she told herself that everything would be okay. Ethan loved her. That was all that mattered. She had no idea that, by the end of the night, the world she had built would come crashing down. The evening had started with so much hope, but in a matter of moments, everything shattered. Grace could feel the tension thick in the air as Vivian leaned closer to Ethan, whispering something in his ear. The words were too soft for Grace to hear, but she could see the effect they had on her husband. His entire posture stiffened, his fingers curled into a fist, and when he turned to face her, the warmth in his eyes had been replaced by something dark, something she had never seen before. "What did you say to him?" Grace asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Ethan didn't answer. Instead, his glare bore into her, his jaw clenched in anger. Then, without warning, he slammed his glass down on the table, the sound echoing through the room. "You cheated on me, didn't you?" he spat, his voice laced with venom. The accusation hit Grace like a slap before he even laid a hand on her. Her breath caught in her throat as she tried to process what he had just said. "What?" "Ethan, no, I would never." "Don't lie to me," he shouted, pushing his chair back so violently that it nearly toppled over. "My mother just told me everything. She saw you sneaking around, meeting another man. And now, you're pregnant? You expect me to believe it's mine?" The room spun. Grace's heart pounded as she turned to Vivian, who sat smugly, a satisfied smirk tugging at her lips. This was her doing. She had poisoned Ethan's mind, planted the seed of doubt, and now, it was growing into something dangerous. "Ethan, please, listen to me," Grace begged, stepping forward, but the moment she did, everything went wrong. A sharp crack filled the air as Ethan's hand connected with her cheek. The pain was immediate, searing, but what hurt more was the betrayal. She stumbled back, pressing a trembling hand to her face, her vision blurred by tears. The man she loved, the man she thought she knew, had just hit her. Silence followed, thick and suffocating. Then, as if in slow motion, something slipped from her purse and landed on the floor. The pregnancy test. Ethan's eyes flickered to it, realization dawning too late. But Grace didn't care. She didn't wait for an apology or an explanation. Her body moved before her mind could catch up, her instinct screaming at her to run. The front door burst open, and a familiar voice cut through the tension. Grace. It was Chloe, their neighbor, her face filled with alarm. She had heard everything. Without hesitation, she rushed forward, grabbing Grace's arm. Come with me, she urged. Grace didn't resist. She let Chloe pull her away, out of the house, out of the nightmare she had been living in. As she stepped into the night, she made a silent promise, to her unborn child, to herself. She would never go back. From the very beginning, Vivian had never accepted Grace. To her, no woman would ever be good enough for Ethan. She had spent years planting seeds of doubt in his mind, subtly chipping away at his love for his wife. Every small mistake Grace made, every little imperfection, Vivian magnified it into something unforgivable. She doesn't take care of you the way she should, she would say. You deserve better. Over time, Ethan had begun to listen. He had started to see Grace not as his partner, but as someone constantly failing him. Vivian's control over Ethan was absolute. She knew how to manipulate him, how to twist reality until he saw things her way. Grace could feel it happening, but no matter how hard she tried, she could never break the hold Vivian had on him. If dinner was late, Vivian would sigh dramatically, shaking her head as if Grace had committed an unforgivable sin. If Ethan came home tired, she would whisper, "She doesn't respect your hard work. A good wife would make your life easier." Ethan, once so devoted, had begun to echo his mother's sentiments. Maybe she's right, he would mutter under his breath. Maybe you don't really care. Vivian's obsession with controlling her son reached a dangerous peak when she began to suspect that Grace was pregnant. Instead of congratulating her, instead of even asking, she let her mind wander to the worst possible conclusion. To Vivian, Grace carrying Ethan's child wasn't a joyous occasion, it was a threat. A child would bind them together in a way she could not control. And so, she did what she had always done. She poisoned Ethan's mind. She's been acting strange, hasn't she? Vivian mused one evening, her tone casual but deliberate. Coming home late? Hiding things from you? Ethan frowned, shaking his head. No, she's just been busy with work. Vivian smirked, placing a gentle hand on his arm. Darling, don't be naive. Women like her, they think they can fool men like us. I saw her meeting someone the other day. A man. Ethan stiffened. What? She's been keeping secrets, Ethan. And now, suddenly, she's pregnant? Are you sure that child is even yours? That was all it took. Doubt had already been growing in Ethan's heart, nurtured by years of Vivian's influence. Now, it exploded into full-blown suspicion. He didn't ask Grace. He didn't stop to think. He simply believed his mother, because that's what he had always done. By the time Grace tried to explain the truth, it was too late. The woman who had vowed to love and support him had already been cast as the villain in his mind. Vivian had won. Grace sat in Chloe's guest room, staring blankly at the ceiling, her mind replaying the events of the evening over and over again. The stinging pain on her cheek had faded, but the emotional wound Ethan left was far deeper. She had loved him. She had believed in their marriage. But in one moment of blind rage, he had shattered everything. Heartbreak, betrayal, and fear tangled inside her, making it hard to breathe. How had it come to this? Just hours ago, she had been excited, hopeful even. She had imagined Ethan's face lighting up when she told him about the baby. Instead, she had watched the man she loved turn into a stranger, a man who had struck her without hesitation, a man who had believed his mother's lies over the woman who had stood by his side through everything. Tears welled up in Grace's eyes as she clutched her stomach protectively. This wasn't just about her anymore. The moment Ethan's hand had connected with her face, he had shown her exactly what kind of man he had become. If she stayed, what kind of future would that mean for her child? Would she raise her baby in a home where anger and violence were acceptable? Would she allow her child to grow up watching their mother be treated as if she were nothing? The thought sent a shiver down her spine. As much as she loved Ethan, she couldn't ignore the truth any longer. Their marriage had been crumbling for a long time, poisoned by Vivian's constant manipulation. Grace had convinced herself that if she just tried harder, if she just proved herself, things would get better. But no matter what she did, it had never been enough. And now, it never would be. The next morning, Ethan called. Then he called again. And again. Grace stared at the screen, her fingers trembling over the answer button. A part of her wanted to hear his voice, to believe that this had all been some terrible misunderstanding. But deep down, she knew better. She let the call go to voicemail, but the messages came quickly. The first was filled with anger. "Grace, where the hell are you? Come home now." The second, a bit softer, an attempt at control. "We need to talk. Don't make this worse than it is." By the third, his tone had shifted completely. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean it. Mom got in my head. Please, Grace. I love you." Grace shut her eyes, letting out a slow, shaky breath. The old her, the woman who had spent years trying to fix things, might have believed him. Might have convinced herself that love could overcome even this. But not anymore. Love was not supposed to hurt. Love was not supposed to leave bruises. And love certainly wasn't supposed to come with conditions dictated by a toxic mother-in-law. For the first time in years, Grace saw her marriage for what it really was. It had never been a true partnership. She had been walking on eggshells, trying to earn the love of a man who had been slowly slipping away from her all along. She had allowed herself to believe that if she just endured, if she just loved him enough, things would change. But now, she understood, love was not enough. Taking a deep breath, she deleted Ethan's messages. Then, she blocked his number. It was over. She didn't know what the future held, but one thing was certain, she was never going back. Ethan sat alone in the dimly lit apartment, his hands clasped together as he replayed that terrible night in his mind. The moment his hand struck Grace, everything had changed. He had seen the fear in her eyes, the shock, the pain. And then she was gone. Days turned into weeks, and no matter how many times he called, she never picked up. He had lost her. Worse, he had lost the family they were supposed to build together. At first, he had blamed everything but himself, Vivian, stress, even Grace for running away instead of talking things through. But as the silence stretched on, the truth became impossible to ignore. He had let his mother control him, poisoning his marriage with her manipulations. He had failed as a husband. And if he didn't change, he would fail as a father too. Determined to prove he could be better, Ethan took the first real step, therapy. Not just for show, not just as an empty promise to get Grace back, but because he needed help. He needed to understand his anger, his toxic dependence on his mother's approval, and how to become the man Grace had once believed he was. Session after session, he confronted his past, his mistakes, and the damage he had caused. It wasn't easy, but for the first time, he was willing to put in the work. The biggest step, however, was cutting ties with Vivian. She had ruled his life for far too long, convincing him that he had to choose between her and Grace. But he finally saw the truth, his mother was toxic, and as long as she remained in his life, he could never be the husband and father he wanted to be. So, he made the hardest decision of all, he removed her from their home and filed a restraining order, ensuring that she could no longer manipulate him or interfere with his future. When Ethan sent proof of his therapy sessions and the restraining order to Grace, she hesitated. She had spent so long loving him, wanting to believe he could change. But was it real this time? Or just another empty promise? After much thought, she agreed to meet him, but on her terms. No rushing back into their marriage, no sweeping the past under the rug. If there was any chance of reconciliation, it would be on a foundation of real change. She demanded couples therapy, full accountability, and, above all, zero tolerance for violence. One mistake, and it would be over for good. Ethan nodded, understanding that this was his last chance. He had lost Grace once, and he refused to lose her again. But was love enough to rebuild what had been broken? Only time would tell. Grace had hoped that leaving Ethan would mean an end to the chaos, but Vivian wasn't ready to let her go so easily. In Vivian's eyes, Grace was still the enemy, the woman who had stolen her son and then turned him against her. And now, with Grace carrying Ethan's child, Vivian saw an opportunity to regain control. It started subtly. At first, Grace thought she was imagining things, an unfamiliar car parked near her workplace, glimpses of a familiar figure lingering just out of sight. But then the harassment escalated. Vivian began showing up at Grace's office, lurking outside the building during lunch hours. She never confronted Grace directly, but her presence was unmistakable, a silent reminder that she was always watching. One afternoon, Grace stepped out for a breath of fresh air, only to find Vivian standing just a few feet away. "You think you can take my son and my grandchild away from me?" Vivian hissed, her eyes filled with fury. "You don't deserve this family. I will make sure you regret everything." Shaken, Grace rushed back inside and locked herself in the restroom, struggling to catch her breath. Enough was enough. She couldn't live in fear, especially not while carrying her child. She immediately called Ethan, her voice trembling as she recounted what had happened. Ethan had been trying to make amends, working through therapy and proving he could be better. But when Grace told him about Vivian's threats, he realized just how deep his mother's toxicity ran. It wasn't just about their broken marriage anymore. Vivian was actively trying to hurt the mother of his child. Without hesitation, Ethan called the police and reported Vivian's harassment. But he knew that wouldn't be enough. His mother had manipulated and controlled him for years, and now she was doing the same to Grace. If he truly wanted to protect Grace and their baby, he had to take stronger action. The next day, Ethan filed for a restraining order against Vivian. It wasn't an easy decision. Cutting off his own mother completely felt like severing a piece of his past. But he knew it was necessary. He had spent too long letting her dictate his life, and now, he was finally choosing to stand up for Grace and their unborn child. When Vivian received the court order, her fury was uncontrollable. She tried to call Ethan, screaming that he was betraying his own blood. But this time, Ethan didn't waver. "I'm done, Mom," he told her firmly. "If you can't respect my family, then you have no place in my life." For the first time, Vivian realized that she had truly lost control. But the question remained, was this really the end of her threats? Or was she just getting started? After everything that had happened, Grace knew she needed time to heal. The betrayal, the violence, and the relentless harassment from Vivian had left deep emotional scars. She couldn't simply forgive and forget. More than anything, she needed to focus on herself and her unborn child. That's why she decided to stay with Chloe, her closest friend and the person who had been there for her when she had nowhere else to go. Living with Chloe provided Grace with a sense of security she hadn't felt in a long time. There were no sudden outbursts, no tension looming in the air, just peace. She spent her days reflecting on everything she had endured, slowly regaining the emotional strength she had lost in her toxic marriage. But despite her newfound independence, she couldn't ignore the fact that Ethan was actively trying to change. Ethan had been persistent in proving he was different. He respected Grace's space, only reaching out when necessary and never pushing her for an answer she wasn't ready to give. He sent her updates about his therapy sessions, showing her the work he was putting in to understand his past behavior. More importantly, he had completely cut ties with Vivian, refusing to let her manipulate him any longer. But Grace knew words meant nothing without action, so she monitored Ethan carefully, waiting to see if his transformation was real or just another temporary change. Eventually, after weeks of no pressure from Ethan and no more threats from Vivian, Grace agreed to couples therapy. She wasn't making any promises, but if there was even a chance that their relationship could be rebuilt in a healthy way, she needed to explore it. Their first session was tense. Sitting across from each other, the weight of their shared past hung between them. Ethan was the first to speak. "I failed you," he admitted, his voice raw with emotion. "I let my mother control me, and I took my anger out on you instead of standing up for the woman I loved." Hearing those words was painful, but also necessary. Grace needed to know that Ethan truly understood the damage he had caused. Over the next few sessions, they worked through the layers of their broken marriage. Grace expressed her fears and the deep-seated hurt she still carried. Ethan, in turn, acknowledged how his childhood with Vivian had shaped his actions, but he refused to use it as an excuse. For the first time in their relationship, Ethan wasn't just asking for forgiveness, he was proving his commitment through action. He listened more than he spoke, he validated Grace's feelings instead of dismissing them, and he showed up for every therapy session without fail. It wasn't an instant fix. Trust, once broken, takes time to rebuild. But for Grace, the difference now was that she had a choice. She wasn't trapped, she wasn't forced to stay, she was choosing to see if their love could survive. And if it couldn't, she knew she would be okay on her own. Grace had been through more than she ever imagined. She had once believed in a perfect marriage, in the idea that love could conquer all. But life had shown her the painful truth: love alone was not enough. Trust, respect, and safety mattered just as much, if not more. Now, as she stood at a crossroads, she knew that whatever decision she made, it would be on her terms. Despite Ethan's efforts to change, Grace wasn't ready to fully trust him again. He had shattered that trust the night he raised his hand against her. Words of regret and promises of change were not enough to erase that moment. However, she couldn't ignore the steps he was taking. He had removed Vivian from his life, filed a restraining order against her, and continued therapy without expecting immediate forgiveness. More than anything, he had stopped pressuring Grace, understanding that this was something she had to decide for herself. Grace was willing to give Ethan a chance, but only under strict conditions. She made it clear that their child's safety and well-being would always come first. There would be no second chances if he ever reverted to his past behavior. She set firm boundaries, ensuring that any future together would be built on mutual respect, not obligation or guilt. Their relationship, if it was to be rebuilt, would be a slow and careful process. Ethan understood this. He didn't beg for instant reconciliation, nor did he try to manipulate her into coming back. Instead, he continued his therapy, not just for Grace but for himself. He acknowledged his flaws and worked to become a better person, not just a better husband. He knew that no matter how much he wanted to fix things, Grace had to make the final decision in her own time. As for Grace, she wasn't the same woman who once believed in fairy tale endings. She had found strength in herself, learned the value of independence, and realized that she didn't need Ethan to be happy. Whether they ended up together or not, she would be okay. That knowledge alone gave her the power she had once felt she lost. Their future remained uncertain, but it was no longer clouded by fear or blind hope. It was a future built on cautious optimism, one where Grace held control of her own destiny. Whatever happened next, it would be her choice. And for the first time in a long time, that was enough.